Today is March 2nd, 1996. My name is Charlie Henson. I'm with Abilene Christian University. I'm interviewing F. George Hatt, Jr. in the home of Maurice Glover. This will be a part of the 12th Armored Division Oral History Project. We're going to start today, Mr. Hatt, with kind of a history of your family because we want to know who you came from, how you became the person you are.
That's a large order. I mean, I became the person I am. Long story. But my father was Fenwick George Hatt. Later he was called Senior because I was his first son and was Junior. My mother was Thelma Rebecca Myers. Thelma Rebecca Myers was born in Sherman, Texas in 1900. I believe her father came from Indiana. Her mother was from north central Texas, a little village called Aurora, which doesn't exist anymore. My father was born in Boston, Massachusetts, to Canadian parents who were from Nova Scotia. He was the only American in his family. All the other children, of which there were about 5 or 6, were born in Canada. And when World War I started, my father was a member of the Canadian Army. When the United States got into World War I, then he decided that he wanted to become an American soldier. He did. And to make a long story short, he ended up in San Antonio in 1918. And at that time, my mother and her family were living in San Antonio. My grandfather was an engineer in an insane asylum. But that's how my mother and father became acquainted, was in San Antonio while he was still in the Army. I was born in San Antonio in 1923. Things were going well in the 1920s, I think. My father was doing well. He was out of the Army and in business there and doing quite well. And then the Depression time came, and we began to move around the state of Texas. Lived in Fort Worth for a very short period, lived in Lubbock, Texas. We were in Amarillo for a short period, then into Dallas and Oak Cliff area of Dallas. Finally settled down and stayed in one place about the time I got into the 4th grade. I graduated from North Dallas High School in January of 1941. I went to Texas A&M starting in 1941, right before the Pearl Harbor attack. I was a freshman down there when the attack came, of course. I was taking chemical engineering. Really wanted to get my engineering degree. Working hard toward that. Didn't want to get drafted. So, how much more of a story do you want on this background?
Let's go back to. Do you have brothers and sisters? And
yes,
who
I
they
do
are?
have a brother, and his name is Melbourne Ernest. He's 3 years younger than I, and lives in Dallas now, and he is an engineer there.
If you were to describe your mother for me, can you give me a description in the strengths that she tried to instill in you?
Oh my goodness.
And then also your father, the same thing.
Well, my mother was blind. She had a little sight in her younger years, but she was had such poor sight that she went to school for the blind in Austin and graduated there from high school, which was about as good as most people were doing well, let's see, I suppose she graduated about 1918. She was a person of strong beliefs, a real Democrat. She, she loved Franklin Roosevelt, had great disdain for Herbert Hoover and big business, but she made sure that we followed the fairly strict discipline. She was not bad. She loved us very much, took care of us. Even though she couldn't see well, she played the piano. She was quite a remarkable person. My father was a great salesman. He traveled and was gone from home a lot, which was unfortunate because we did miss him. But he would leave on Monday morning, go out of town, and come back Friday evening. And that was a regular schedule for years and years. He worked for the Pearl Brewery Company back during Prohibition. When Prohibition was no longer a law, and they started making alcoholic beer, he worked at that for a few years, and my mother and dad decided they didn't like that business. So they got out of it, and he was a man who worked in ice cream and fruits and flavors and that sort of thing. He loved motorboats. He had a motorboat on White Rock Lake. We spent many a nice weekend out there, just the kids playing around, and he was working on the motorboat.
With your mother's handicap or her lack of being able to see, do you believe that made you and your brother more self-sufficient?
Well, I've never thought of it that way. Maybe, perhaps. We had a certain amount of concern, although we didn't show a lot of it, to make sure that everything went all right for her. I don't know about that. I really can't tell.
Okay. Going through high school, what were your interests? What things did you like to do in high school?
The thing that I liked were technical subjects in high school. I liked sports, particularly football. I liked ROTC, military. I liked that. And a lot of that had to do with the background that I had, I believe, as a small child in San Antonio, the celebration of the armistice and the soldiers and all the parades and that kind of thing. But those were the kind of things I was interested in. And I had a certain amount of interest in girls, but not a whole lot. That came later.
Okay, tell us about the decision to go to A&M.
My uncle was a graduate of A&M. He was a first lieutenant when I first remember him. He eventually became a colonel and was in charge of the protection of the harbor in Boston during World War II. But I remember seeing him and thinking that he looked like he was doing very well, a graduate of A&M, and I think my parents probably talked that up to me. Besides that, it didn't cost much to go to school there, and it was easy to get into. And by the way, it was really easy to lose your place there. It was hard to stay in. Then
Tell me about that.
Well, the thing about that is I just remember going down there with our class. Let's see, the whole school had about 6,000 in it, I think, and our class came in with a couple of thousand boys. And by the end of the first semester, almost half of them were gone. They left.
Was it grades, or was it the discipline that was part of A&M, or?
You're absolutely right. It was all of those things. And it was not necessarily the most pleasant place, because there certainly were no girls going to school there, and that makes a big difference, I think. You know, a lot of interest was gone. You had to wait till the weekend and invite them down. But A&M has a great spirit. Guys really had strong ties and they never forget it, even up till today.
Tell me your uncle's name, who was in charge of the Boston Harbor.
Colonel Ben Cordell.
And he finally retired from the Army? Or
He retired from the Army a long time ago, and I couldn't tell you exactly when, and lived in San Antonio after his retirement. He was married to my mother's sister.
As you started into A&M, tell about being a freshman in a military school, all that entailed.
Well, now that could be a lot of stories, huh? And you're talking about thinking back a long ways to think of the detail on that. I remember when I went down to A&M, I'd already had contact with some friends who had been down there before, and I had a very close friend who had gone to A&M, and by the way, he had quit after a year. And he told me about all the tricks and hazing and things that come from the upperclassmen, and I had a pretty good knowledge of what was going on, what they would really do and what they really wouldn't do. Also, there was a young man that I met who was getting ready to be a junior down there. I met him the summer before I went down there, and we became very close friends. And I liked him a lot, and that had made an impression on me. When we arrived, I knew we were going to be hazed and we were going to be mistreated and all that, and I tried to get away with as much stuff as I could, and I did. I was a little bit bigger guy than a lot of the fellas, and I think some of those upperclassmen left me alone because I was a little bit bigger than they were. But because I saw some of those smaller guys, and they really, you know, they had a hard time compared with the way I went. But I was glad to become a sophomore, and much gladder to become a junior, which I did before I went off to the Army.
Tell me your best story. Like
My
if
best
your
story?
best story of your first year, the story
first
that always pops to your mind.
Best story. I would never in the world be able to pick up my best story. I don't know what that would be. My first year. I don't know, but I can tell you one about my second year. This may not appeal to you very much. Because in my second year, the war had started, and a great number of Navy, what do they call those fellows, V1s or something, V12 students came in, and there were some soldiers that were stationed, were brought in to go to school. And on the weekend, those fellows this was a dry county, and those fellows were always going around looking for some liquor. So a buddy of mine and I decided, hey, here's a chance to make a little money. So we didn't have a car, but we did have a little satchel that we always carried when we'd go hitchhiking to go home. So he and I hitchhiked across the river to the next county. We'd fill those bags up, we'd hitchhike back, and we'd sell them to the soldiers, and we'd make, maybe about 30% on that liquor. Another story was in a physics class that I always liked. We had an old physics professor there. He was famous for the things he would do. They'd have all of these physics students up high in this big room, and he wanted to to present how the melting point of ice goes down, I believe it is, when it gets under pressure. So he took and put a block of ice up, put a wire over it, put a big heavy weight under it, and then put a plank on the floor. He said, I know exactly what it's going to take to cause this to melt and how long it will go. Then he turned down the lights and began to lecture on something else and showing some kind of slides and that kind of thing. By this time, there were a lot of people sound asleep in there. That happened in physics class. It's dark in there. And all of a sudden, that big, heavy chunk was turned loose by the ice because it melted all the way through. That thing went bang. And everybody jumped up and the lights turned on. Professor never moved a muscle or anything. He just kept on with his lecture, never said anything.
What was his professor's name?
I don't know.
Don't remember.
I can't remember any longer.
Okay. Describe A&M when the war started, the mood, what it was like to be in A&M during the war.
Well, the draft was on. And the feeling that people had who were in school seriously and able to make their grades was not to get drafted. And that was a real concern because we all had to register for the draft. So we were always thinking of how do you know, we better make our grades to do well. There was I can only tell you how I felt, and I don't know how much we talked about this kind of thing, but the stories that were coming out of the Philippines were awful about the Death March in particular. The story about Pearl Harbor being bombed, that was a bad thing, but the way the Americans were losing the war was a very upsetting thing. They were falling back, they were being taken prisoner, they were being mistreated, they were being killed when they were captives, and so there was a very bad feeling about that. Everyone, of course, wanted to continue on with his education so he could become a commissioned officer. That certainly was one of my goals.
Let's get you into junior year. What happened in the junior year, and then where you went to get you into the Army?
Well, I got halfway through my junior year, and there was something that I've forgotten exactly what it was, but I didn't get what's called a contract. There were a limited number of contracts that were given to students with the government, and I didn't get a contract, and I tried really hard I think maybe I missed some grade points or something. I can't recall. But I knew that if I got a contract, I had a good chance of getting a commission with the training in OCS. I was in chemical warfare unit at that time, but my PMS&T would not agree to that. So I ended up with a warning that if I didn't join the enlisted reserve corps, that I could very well be drafted. And if I wanted to stay in school, I'd better join the enlisted reserve corps. So I did. I was sworn in on the one-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the 7th of December in 1942. Well, that was, the whole truth of it is, the government, I guess, the Army didn't care. When they needed men, they went and got them, and sure enough, at the end of that semester, my first semester as a junior, we were all called to active duty, those of us who were in that situation. And a whole large contingency of A&M boys ended up Camp Maxey near Paris, Texas, in basic training. We were inducted in Mineral Wells at the Camp Walters there. And that was in like the, I don't know, 1st or 2nd or 3rd of June of 1943. Then we were shipped over for basic training.
Tell us about your basic training.
Someplace. We went over there on a train. When we got there, we were marched to this place where there were high barbed wire fences, you know, 10 or 12 feet high, and surrounding an area, and there were some new barracks type places in there. Instead of regular bathrooms and that kind of thing, they had outhouses, and we were brought in there and said, "Okay, fellas, put your stuff up. This is where you're going to be." And what is this? I said, "Well, this is the place where they were going to bring Japanese, and they were going to incarcerate Japanese, but they don't have any they're not taking Japanese prisoners, so it's empty. So you're here." And we called it the Jap Trap. It was a pretty bad place, but we were there only about a week, I guess, and we were moved to regular barracks after that. It was a great time to be with other A&M fellows, and there were some from some of the other A&M affiliated schools, like North Texas Agricultural College. And we went through a training that would be a little different from what most new inductees would go through because of our military background. We already knew how to do close order drill and a lot of other things. And we were individuals were assigned to be leaders for a period of time, maybe for a week, and then they changed to a new set of leaders. There would be a company commander, there'd be platoon leaders. We all had a shot at doing that kind of thing. And we had some of our old A&M football players in there. They'd get us into some pretty rowdy training, the defense type thing, and sometimes you just about get into a fist fight over that kind of stuff. And that happened occasionally, but it was a very hot summer, very hot.
Describe some of the rowdy things, maybe one situation, so we can kind of have a feel of that.
There was a game, what was that, where what you did was to go over, you divided the groups into two parts, and then you had like a goal line on each side, but they were not separated very far, maybe 50 feet. And the thing was that your team was to go over and drag the other guy across your goal. And I got a hold of one of our football players. I can't think of his name right now. And he wasn't quite as heavy as I was, but he was a wiry guy. And I began to drag him, and he didn't like that. And he'd pull back, and pretty soon he was doing this toward me. And but we didn't swing at each other. We just had a few words between us. And incidentally, I saw that man after World War II in Germany, and he was playing football on one of the Army football teams there. And we were glad to see each other.
Do you remember his name?
No, well, no. It's
Was your basic training what you
I can't think of it
expected?
now. Pardon?
Was the basic training what you expected?
I guess I had no expectations. I didn't know what to expect. Did a lot of long marches, running obstacle courses. Do you ever hear of an obstacle course? And we'd end up at the end with a fixed bayonets running across this thing with that bayonet, and at the end was a representative of a human being, and we'd stick that bayonet in them and yell. We were swinging over ponds of water, and it was kind of tough. And some of those kids were not strong enough to handle. You know, it'd be maybe a little heavy for their strength, and they're just not strong, and they couldn't climb things, and they'd have a really tough time. And some of them managed to overcome some of that, and some of them never quite. You know, they'd jump for a rope and grab it, and they weren't strong enough to hold on. They'd fall in the water every time. That kind of thing. Kind of felt for those guys. But in the end, I think they were all stronger for it.
What happened to those that, did they stay in the Army? Or
Sure.
they just...
Didn't make any difference. They didn't have anything to do with it. They put a rifle in the hands of a fellow like that, and he'd be just as good a combat man as anybody else.
Okay, get us out of basic training and head us on down towards Europe.
Europe.
Well, I mean, between, not yet to Europe, but from basic training till you
Okay.
got to Berkeley.
Okay. I thought the Army was really telling me the truth when they said at the end of basic training, you have an opportunity, you can go to OCS, infantry OCS, you can join the Air Corps if you want to take pilot training, or you can get in the Army Specialized Training Program, which is ASTP, and that you could continue your engineering studies. I said, oh boy, they're telling me the truth, they're going to let me finish my education. So I said, I'll take ASTP. I don't want to go to infantry OCS and become an infantry officer. And the Air Corps never did sound like the thing I wanted to do. So we ended up going to various schools scattered around. We went to, my particular group went to the advanced engineering at Texas Tech in Lubbock. That was a great time. I really liked it there. And sure enough, finally we got in a school where there were girls. The guys were all gone, by the way, just like we were. The girls were moved out of their newest dormitory and was turned over to us. The best kitchen, the best cook, the best food. They put the girls in the old boys' dormitory across the street. And that was fun, but the schooling was good. We took junior level courses, and we took equivalent of 2 semesters, so I was able to get a little credit that I could transfer to A&M in later years. But that was a great time. We were fairly free, freer than the Air Corps fellows that were in there on pre-flight training. They couldn't do anything. They were tied into their dormitories. They were really strict on the discipline. We were able to have time off for social things as well as having good academic courses.
What courses did you take specifically?
Well, in this case, it was mechanical engineering, and up to that time, I'd had chemical engineering. And in fact, I was repeating a course or two, which made it a lot easier. And it was not my choice, it was theirs.
Tell me about some of the men that were in Tech with you, that you might have...
In Tech? Texas Tech? Oh, we had fellows who had gone to college all over the country. Some from New York, and I remember. There were a lot of Yankees in there. Oh boy, an Ohio State fellas. Got to be friends with them, and one of the best friends I ever had I met there. He had been at the Jap Trap previously, but we were in different companies, so we hadn't met before. His name is Ray Collier. That's where we became acquainted, and we're great friends to this day. There was one fellow, George Fisher. He was a big man from Ohio. Later on became an MP in the 12th Armored Division. But he was a jolly good fellow that I liked a whole lot. Just a good, friendly guy. If you can imagine someone like that becoming an MP, it doesn't seem quite right, but he was. There were people that I was of the type that I was not used to knowing from other parts of the country. and this is an important thing that happened in World War II, is that people were mixed, men were mixed together a lot in the military forces, and they were able to meet the kinds of people perhaps they only saw in movies before. And there were fellows from, as I was saying, from all over.
Tell us about the end of ASTP school.
About the what?
The end of ASTP.
Oh, the end of ASTP.
And how you found out that you would, that process, that what happened.
Well, we thought ASTP would go on forever. Right on until we got our degree, maybe. We went into ASTP like the beginning of October of 1943. And when March came, the word was out, they're going to close the program down. I said, wait a minute. It isn't going to happen after all. We are going to have to go back into the Army. We're not going to get to finish school. And lists were placed on the bulletin board of all of the men that were there. Now, how many, I'm not sure anymore, perhaps 300 to 400 men. And they were alphabetical. They went down so far, drew a line. These fellows are going one place, 99th Division. And these fellows, the next group, are going to go down to anti-tank destroyer units. And then I was on the list that said, you're going to 12th Armored Division at Camp Barkley. Well, there was no, you had no control over it. There was nothing you could do. You were sworn into the Army. You had the Articles of War read to you once a month. And not many people really realize what threats there are in the Articles of War, about what can happen to you if you don't obey your commanders. So we got on a train and ended up outside of Abilene, Texas, Camp Barkley, kind of a dry, sort of cactus-ridden place. We were taken as a group to a building where they were making interviews and asking to find out where we would be assigned. So they call you up one at a time. You go sit down with an officer. There was a captain there that I was assigned to. After he talked to me a little bit, he said, what kind of a job would you like to have in the 12th Armored Division? I said, I don't know. I'd like to have something where I could use my training. I said, now, I've had the equivalent of over 3 years of college education, and I would really like that. So he got up, walked across the room, and talked to somebody, and he came back and he said, how would you like to be a first echelon mechanic on a half-track? I didn't know what a half-track was. I had no idea. And I certainly didn't know what a first echelon mechanic would be. I said, well, I guess that'd be all right. He said, okay, bang. He said, next. He said, go down at the end of the building and get with that group of fellows you see down there. I went down there. There was Ray Collier and some of the other fellows from Texas Tech. They said, I said, where are you going? They said, we're going to the infantry. Where are you going? I said, I'm not going to the infantry. I'm going to be a mechanic on a first echelon mechanic on a half-track. And then I found out, sure enough, I was just a rifleman and was assigned to the mortar squad in Company A of the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion.
Tell me about conversations that you and Ray Collier had back at Tech when y'all found out that you were going to be leaving. How did you two deal with that, being good friends?
I'd have to be careful about the kind of words that we use because they were not too acceptable in, nice company. We felt like that. We felt like that the Army was not doing what they said they would do. They had been dishonest with us, and that they really were taking advantage of their power over us, and we didn't think that was right, but then we knew that there was nothing we could do about that. We were just angry. We really were. We were angry about that. And we got even angrier when we found out we were going into the infantry. Who wanted to be in the infantry? We certainly didn't. I can't remember any details on the conversations except I think maybe if you talked to Ray Collier or read some of his stuff, you'd probably find some things in there that he remembers better than I do.
Okay. Okay, y'all ended up, you're at the end of the, at the end of the building. You found out where they're going, where you're going. Tell us about where you lived and describe the living situation and how you got settled in.
We were loaded up in a 6x6 truck in the back, carrying our duffel bags, and drove up in front of, drove maybe a mile or so in front of a bunch of, I almost call them like tar paper shacks and some buildings built out of plywood. Good grief, they were pretty sorry looking buildings. But they were all nice and evenly spaced and set there, and everything was clean. He said, well, this is your place. Dismount, come on in. We went in and we were told, well, we were going to be a part of this company. Okay, fellas, I'll tell you what, we've got a name of the people here. Get in these barracks here. And the next day they got out the list of names, said, all right, now you're going to be assigned here and somebody else is going to be assigned there, but right now you're going to go through some training. Now, they didn't know we had physical education up at Texas Tech. They treated us like we came in off the street or something and turned us over to a staff sergeant. Really a fine fellow. And the first thing he did was start giving us calisthenics. And the simplest calisthenics I ever saw. It's just like we'd never had exercise in our life, but that's the way we were treated to do these calisthenics. And after about 2 days of this kind of stuff and discussions about you're in this organization, we were split up and separated into the various squads within the company. And I was assigned to the mortar squad of the 3rd platoon. Staff Sergeant Charles Ruma was the squad leader there. A man from St. Louis. A fellow named Harold Capretta from Columbus, Ohio. Who were the others? I can't call their names right now. But there were 8 of us.
Describe your hutment. If you were to close your eyes and you were to walk up to your door, describe where y'all lived.
Well, the hutment was, as I said before, built out of plywood. It had some sort of sliding windows just so it could be closed, and they had screens on them. There was a screen door, very simple screen door, and then a door that you could close on the inside. The hutment was set up on blocks, probably concrete blocks or something. You'd step up inside. You could see between the pieces of plywood on the floor, you could see the ground below. The hutment was wide enough that you could put cots in them a line of cots on each side and a line of cots in the middle. Probably long enough that they could put 3 cots end to end. Something about like that. So you could get a squad, a rifle squad with 12 guys in it in one of those hutments. It was not painted. The roof didn't leak. I don't believe it did. Never do I remember water coming in. The beds were just iron with a single layer of spring type thing, a thin mattress, maybe 2.5 inches thick. It was all right. We were told there were certain places that we would place where we could place our equipment, place our duffel bags, our clothes. I believe there may have been some place where we could hang a few clothes, maybe in one corner. I'm not sure exactly how that was set up any longer. But the hutment was really not the most wonderful place in the world. It was a place you could sleep, except they wouldn't let you sleep very long. You go to bed and then they want to get you up at 4 o'clock in the morning because they have roll call. Get you out in that cool air and call everybody's name in the dark. Then you go back and finish dressing and go get in line for breakfast in the morning. Cooks had been up since about 3 preparing breakfast. And it was, Army type food.
Tell me about your relationship. Did you have any interaction with the community in Abilene?
Yes, I did. Partly, they had a USO club there. That was one thing. And another thing is that there was a family there that I had met. And the reason I had met this family is that there was a fellow at Texas Tech, and I should have mentioned him, who came from Abilene. His name was James Delitas. His family had a candy company called the Candy Kitchen. And while we were in Texas Tech, we had come down for a weekend there, and I was the guest in their home. I got to meet their family. He had a sister there that I had a date with. But that was those were some people that I knew. And when we were at Camp Barkley, well, I'd go by and see Mrs. Delitas at the candy shop from time to time. Say hello. She was always nice and glad to see us. And James had gone off to another unit somewhere when he left Texas Tech. I don't know where he went. I've forgotten now where he went. But I know that those people still have that kind of business right in Abilene. I've been in there. James's younger brother was in there, and I remember him as a boy. And I think he runs that business now. So I had that kind of contact. The USO Club was a good place to go to, and I think there were 2 of them. And they provided ways for entertainment and material, so you could do things if you wanted to. I used to enjoy sitting and drawing pictures and that kind of thing. And they had a dark room that you could use, and I'd take pictures with my little camera. I'd go in there and develop them in that dark room and make pictures. They provided cookies and coffee and refreshments, and it was just generally a very nice thing to have to go to, because the streets were full of soldiers. Oh, they were just everywhere, and it was good to get some of them off the street and into the USO. And they'd fill up every movie theater. It was something to see. People in this day and time probably could never imagine exactly how it was. You can't describe it, so that people can have that feeling of being inundated with men that you didn't know. And they were basically pretty good guys, although they kept plenty of MPs around to make sure that happened. And I watched the MPs go into action a couple of times. They made sure that the guys didn't get too rowdy or bad.
Okay, let's go to your training at Berkeley. What kind of training, and tell me about the day that you found out what your real job was.
The day I found out what my real job was. Well, I think the day that I found out what my real job was, when I got to be that first echelon mechanic, I was told I would be the assistant driver on this half-track, but I was still the rifleman in that squad. There were 2 riflemen in that squad. Yeah, I was one of them. And I didn't like that. I didn't like that at all. But there was one fellow in that squad also who had a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, and I couldn't understand that, how he gets stuck in a... And in a way, that made me feel a little better to see somebody else suffering, maybe worse than I was. The feeling was I didn't like it. I didn't know anything I could do about it, and I couldn't. I had it. I mean, that was it. I was there, and that was my job. And I'd go out and lie under the half-track and grease it and fall asleep under there with my hands holding on to a wrench because I'd be so tired getting up so early in the morning that it looked like I was working under there. And there really wasn't much to do anyway. We'd done everything there was to do. It's very hot. But the training really was something that I had never experienced before. The whole units were going back in those hills, and you'd end up staying up all night. And I had never done that before. The business of staying up all night. I always had a bed to go to sleep in. I was out there. And we wouldn't have any kind of shelter or anything. Didn't need it because the weather, it was spring. It's like April and May. And it was pretty nice at night. We would ride our half-tracks up that big road that winds up the hill that's still up out there. You can still see it, the old Camp Barclay Road, and get way back in those hills. And there were days when they would say, well, all right, now we're going to be here, and what's going to happen is we're going to make, the unit's going to move in an attack, and well, we'd be just sort of sitting around, and then we could hear the artillery shooting, and we could hear the shells flying over and booming on the other side of us. That was something that was new to the guys. We went through what was called an infiltration course. Now, an infiltration course, we did have that experience in basic training, but we got to repeat it. And we did it at night instead of in the daytime. There was a few lights. There were a lot of machine guns. When I say a lot, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4, 5 of them. And they were set up so nobody would get shot, but you had to crawl through barbed wire and all kinds of obstacles under those machine guns that were firing tracers over your head. And you're on your back and you see these things flying around. That was a part of the training. Just, I guess, to get you... why do you have an infiltration course, and why do you do that? I suppose to show that if you are properly located relative to a deadly thing like that, that you're all right. You certainly didn't stand up out there. Not at all. Close order drill, not much close order drill at all. We did have a final review as we were leaving. A peculiar thing happened on that when we were getting ready to have the final review. And I saw 2 men who were in our company, and they were in civilian clothes standing off to one side. And I said, what are those guys doing over there? I said, well, they're being given a Section 8 discharge. I said, what is that? So that's for medical reasons. I said, they're homosexuals. And I didn't even know that. These men were right there in our company. But the fellows that had been in the company for a long time realized that. But they were discharged, pulled out and discharged from the Army before we moved out and before we went through our final review.
Describe the final review. What was involved in all
The
this?
entire division was in formation in this huge field. You know, we were all dressed up in Class A uniforms, I believe. We certainly were dressed up. We had our weapons with us, and unit after unit then marched by the general, who was the commanding general, and they were lined up according to the number on the battalion, and we were so. Company A of the 17th was the first one to go through after the headquarters group went through. We had a band, flags, you know, very formal, kind of thing you would expect when you see a parade like that.
Okay, tell me about your first memories of Carl Hilton.
Carl Hilton was a pretty good-looking guy. And by the way, he looked like Ray Collier in the face. But he was not quite as tall as Ray. He was shorter than Ray. But those two men looked almost identical. Well, we sure spotted that right away. Didn't really know the man. And I didn't like him too much. Partly because he could find us to the barracks the first weekend we were there after we had an inspection of our weapons and all of our equipment, and we just worked so hard to show them that, you know, we know what we're doing, got everything laid out. And every ASTP boy flunked that inspection, and everybody else was given a pass to go to town. And it made me very angry with that captain. Why did that happen? The captain gave that order. I guess I didn't like him partly just because he was the boss, and he was quite a bossy guy. But he did scare me one morning, really early. We were out in the field, way up in those hills. And my squad was told, we're going to be positioned here. Now, Hatt, you get down there on the ground, right here, where you can look over the edge of this hill, and you watch over there. Now, your job is to watch that area. And the next fellow was placed on off somewhere, not too far away, on each side. Oh, yeah, what am I doing this for? So I took my helmet off, and I laid it on the ground. I rolled over, and this was before daylight. Put my head on my helmet. The next thing I knew, somebody was kicking me on the foot. I looked up, and there was Captain Hilton, and I was asleep. He said, "Soldier, what are you supposed to be doing?" I said, "Sir, I'm supposed to be watching over this hill here." "Well, then get to doing it." I did. I never went to sleep doing that again, anything like that again, I'll guarantee you.
Describe him in a physical way. The first time, his demeanor, what he had on, what he looked like, if you could do that.
Oh, he was a man with a helmet liner. I guess we weren't wearing the steel helmets all the time. I remember seeing him in that. He was a slender fellow, very medium height, looked terribly young to be a captain. He walked around like he was in charge, and he was, and he wanted to demonstrate that, and he did. And I didn't really get to know the man, except I knew what his character was from that, from the way he was treating us. I won't say I ever hated the guy, because I really didn't.
Do you have any thoughts about the purpose of his demeanor towards y'all? Looking
I don't
back.
know. You mean thinking back today?
Mm-hmm.
Only what I've heard. What I've heard is that he wanted to be sure, as far as our group was concerned, he wanted to be sure that they understood that he was in charge and he could do what he wanted to do. And that was the truth. That was a fact. I don't know if we would have doubted it if he hadn't done it. Well, we certainly didn't doubt it after he showed that he could do it.
Was that peculiar to the ASTP boys, or do you think he would have been that way to any group?
I don't know. The men that were there, the fellows that were in the company when we arrived, I think they had a great deal of respect for him because of the way they would describe him. They would say, hey, he's really tough. He comes from Harlan County, Kentucky. I said, really? What does that mean? You know, well, Harlan County, Kentucky was the toughest place in the whole wide world. It's where they have the coal mines, and people are really tough in Harlan County, Kentucky. I guess the miners there carry guns around and go on strikes and do all sorts of things. Well, he was from Harlan County. And that impressed all these men, and they were telling us, we heard it, we listened to it.
As y'all were leaving, as you were leaving Barclay, tell me the relationships that you had with those men and how y'all saw yourselves as a unit.
Well, as we had time together, there's no question that you become, when you become better acquainted, you feel responsible toward other people, and you do respond to them in a better way, and you get to know them, who they are, and something about them. But you do kid around a lot. You know, always a sharp jab back or forth, but you get to where you like them. My poor squad leader, I tried to take advantage of him a lot, and I'd take him right up to the edge. And bless his heart, he'd get so mad at me he couldn't stand it. But he would never do anything bad to me, except he did make me dig a straddle trench one time out in the field out there. I remember that happening. And I don't know exactly what I was doing that caused him to finally break down and make me do it. But he'd never report me to the company commander or anything like that, or try to get me court-martialed. I wouldn't let it go that far. But I would just give him a hard time. I would be the last guy up in the barracks. I'd be down there still asleep. I was so sleepy. And he'd get so mad. He'd say, is that guy Hatt up yet? Nobody would say anything. Hatt, are you up? Expletive. Hatt, get up. And then he'd pick up one of his shoes and he'd throw it clear from one end of the barracks to the other and hit me with it. But, and that's the kind of thing that went on. Now Charlie Ruma, he's got to be a jewel of a guy to put up with somebody like I was, because I wasn't treating him. And a lot of that was because I felt like I was being cheated in that outfit anyway, not being assigned to that. I didn't like that. But Charlie and I became very close in later days.
Okay, we're going to get you out of Barclay. Tell us about the train ride to New York.
Well, there in that hot summer, they told us, hey, get ready. We're packing up. We're going to go overseas. Now, you've gone ahead and passed your test down at Camp Boone. We're going to do that. Put everything in Cosmoline, wrap it up, and get ready. And one day all of that stuff was packed up, boxed up, and gone. Now get your duffel bags full, get everything packed properly. Today we're moving down to where the train comes in. It was close to where the motor pool had been, and by that time the vehicles were all gone. So we went down there that afternoon. We waited for the train. And the sun went down, and we were waiting for the train. Pretty soon, some of those old hillbilly boys that were in the company, they were singing The Great Speckled Bird and all of those old songs. And finally, the train did come, and I think it was probably after midnight when we got on the train and pulled out. The train ride across country was kind of a fun thing, really. We had the windows open because it was pretty hot in the summertime. But especially as we hit the Northwest, Midwest, not Northwest, the Midwest, people would be gathered in these little towns to watch the troops come by on the train, and they would wave or whatever, and anytime we stopped, people would come up and give things to us through the windows. They would bring something to eat or some fruit and all kinds of things, and give us their best wishes, and on we'd go. So we had American people, and that's town after town after town coming through the United States. So I had the feeling that the American people were really backing the troops that were moving to go overseas. And we went to New Jersey, Camp Kilmer, as I recall, New Jersey. And we were there just a few days. We were given a pass to go to New York City. I'd never been in New York City before. And Ray Collier and I went to New York City together. And we spent the night there doing things we shouldn't have done. We came back. We got in about 3 o'clock in the morning. Our passes were still good. And at 4 o'clock, they woke everybody up for close order drill. In Camp Kilmer. I got them all over that nice trip we took into New York City. New York City was a fun place. Went to Stage Door Canteen, which was very famous, and they had a lot of these stage dancing girls and all entertaining and looking after the soldiers. But that was a great train ride up to Camp Kilmer, and a great few days there getting ready to go overseas.
What were your thoughts as you were fixing to leave the United States?
I don't know. By this time you're with friends, you're with people you know, you've been with them, and you're all going together to do something. And it was an exciting thing. There were new horizons, new things to see. We didn't know what was going to happen. In fact, we heard, hey, you fellows are getting over there. They've had the invasion. They've conquered a good part of France. Paris has been liberated now, and you're just going to be Army of Occupation. Well, that just sounded just fine. That was good. And that's what we were thinking, and we were taken from Camp Kilmer by a train or trucks down to go across the river, Hudson River there, to New York City, where the ships come in. We marched off of those and waited around, being served coffee and donuts by the Red Cross, the usual thing. Everybody had an upset stomach all the time with those fried donuts and strong coffee. And we waited around there all day before they finally, well, most of the day, before we finally began to get onto the ship.
Tell me about your ship and
Okay.
going across.
The ship was named the Empress of Australia. An interesting ship, a large ship. And it was a fine ship. It had belonged to Germany in World War I. Was described as being the ship that the Kaiser Wilhelm was to use as his personal transportation about the world after the end of World War I, when he would become the victor. And it became reparations after World War I. The British took it. The ship itself was probably 1,000 feet long, very big ship. We had several thousand troops get on the thing. We were scattered. Oh, and when we got on there, we found out, boy, that place smelled bad. We found out they just brought a bunch of German prisoners of war over there on it, and those guys had the least that people could have in order to live. There was barbed wire all over the place to keep them from going certain places, and so we had a sort of a cleanup job to do right off. Our particular unit was located in Deck D, which was just above the water line. Bad place to be for torpedoes, we thought. The room had tables, long tables, screwed to the floor. They brought in hammocks. Hammocks hung off the ceiling. So people were either sleeping in a hammock, on the table, or under the table. That was the way we slept. The ship, we were allowed to go up on top side every once in a while, get up on deck when, let's see, that was in September. And we started out in the North Sea, and it was kind of nasty, and then I believe we sort of swung south, and we got into some nice weather, and we were allowed to go up on top side. And the fellas started shooting craps up there. There must have been 500 games of crap shooting all over the place. Pretty soon that had boiled down to 100 games of crap shooting. I think finally there was one big one. All the money kept concentrating, and those fellas were handling thousands of dollars. They were laying thousands of dollars in cash down and shooting dice. I didn't get involved in that. I wasn't very good at that. I didn't like to, and I'd be a loser, and I didn't like being a loser. But the Red Cross had handed out a lot of stuff for us to have, and there was one thing that a friend of mine and I got was it had a cardboard checkers board on it, and we got some information on how to make a sextant. We made a sextant, and we had a map with the longitude and latitude, and we traced our position going across by shooting the stars and the sun and using our watches. That was kind of fun, two of us doing that. Funny thing to do, but that's something to do. But it was the largest convoy that had ever crossed the Atlantic, I was told. And we arrived at Liverpool, England. Sat outside of Liverpool, we could see it. Boy, that was a terrible looking place. Everything was black and dark, grungy looking from out where we were. And when it got dark, well, the ship pulled in and we unloaded off the ship.
And y'all went down, where did y'all stay in England?
Well, we were immediately put on trains. And I try to keep this stuff straight in my head, but I'm not sure it's always quite right. We went to a place, we traveled all that night, and I guess part of the next day, and we ended up next to an air base. And there were B-17s flying in there, returning from bombing raids. And the thing that impressed me a lot was every once in a while one would come in and he'd shoot a flare out, which means they got wounded on board. And then the war became more real to us, seeing that kind of thing. And later we were moved farther south to Tidworth Barracks. And there we were able to go into town, and they had some wounded fellows who were recuperating, and they would get out on pass, and some of them badly burned and injured badly in different ways. And they were telling us, one fellow was saying, "Yeah, you guys are in the armored infantry. What about it?" He says, "Well, it seems that the fellows in armored infantry get much worse wounds than just an ordinary infantryman." I thought, oh, I didn't like to hear that. But that's when the reality of the war was really coming on.
What was y'all's training schedule there in England? Did y'all do much training? Or?
We did some training. There wasn't one specific incident that I especially recall. We were on we had been issued half tracks, new half tracks. And we went on in a convoy, even before daylight, heading out. Those things travel very slowly, 10, 15 miles an hour. And as the sun was just coming up, it was very cold, frosty. And I was up in the turret part, and I looked over and I saw something that I'd always seen pictures of. It was Stonehenge. And we drove right by Stonehenge, out in the open, nothing around it. And that was a very impressive thing. Anyway, we went on down and were doing training like making an attack with mortars firing over our head. And we did that attack, and one of our guys got killed by a short mortar round there, one of our company fellows. That was the kind of training we were doing. It was, I don't know what, it didn't seem like you were doing much except doing a lot of walking, huh? But it was I suppose, to keep people coordinated and all together, and how do you keep control of troops. We didn't do things like close order drill. We had a certain guard duty. We always had some certain ones that had to be on guard duty and that kind of thing, but there wasn't a whole lot of training as such there. There was that event that I remember. But we packed...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, we packed up one day and put everything in the half tracks, and the driver and assistant driver, which I was, stayed with the half track, and everybody else was separated and taken away on trucks, and we went down to cross the channel. So I was able to stay with the half track, and there was an advantage to that. You didn't have to do a lot of walking.
Let's scoot back just a little bit for the first person that y'all lost in the company. Describe how that affected you as a group of men. His name, I don't know his name.
I don't think it was treated or thought of as like a disaster. This was thought of as an accident, something that happened. I know we had a memorial service, and a chaplain participated in that, and the reaction to that was, did you hear what that chaplain said? If we want to, what we need to do is to be saved before we die. That's what he was implying about the fellow who was killed. Oh, maybe he wasn't saved. And that was a bad reaction that we had to that memorial service of that sort. I think the fellows in his squad were probably impacted a great deal more than we were. He was in the 2nd platoon, and we were in the 3rd platoon. I knew him, though. He was a friend of mine. It just happened.
What was his name?
I have the name problem. I can't say it.
Okay.
I had to think about it a while.
Okay, tell us about the half tracks, the ships that they used to get that the big pieces of equipment over the channel.
Okay, that's. We were loaded on things called LSTs, landing ship tanks, and they really are a ship with a prow. Opens up, you can drive on. And somehow we ended up on the top deck with our half track, but it was loaded with half tracks, with vehicles. After it was all loaded and all of the different ships that were for the 12th Army were loaded, I guess, then we began to pull out of the harbor. I had noticed that there was a hole through something up there in one part. I said, asked one of the sailors, I said, what is that? He said, oh, we got hit there. I said, well, what is it? He said, well, yeah, we've been in several invasions. It turned out that this was LST number 1 in the United States Navy. Had been in, I think, 5 different invasions. In Sicily and, I guess, I don't know, in North Africa or not. But that wasn't a bad trip at all because the food was very good, much better than the Empress of Australia, which was all boiled goat and potatoes. I had my first experience with what's the word for it? It has to do with losing your balance. And we were inside a small room playing cards, and we were anchored outside of Le Havre, and the ship was going. It was fairly stormy, and all of a sudden I felt like the room we were in was turning completely upside down. That was. I went up topside where I could see where things were, and I stayed up there after that. That was a funny experience. I never had that kind of thing before. But we pulled up at Le Havre. The ship pulled right up on the beach, opened up, we drove off. Arlo Ward was the driver, and I, the two of us, we got into a convoy and headed to, and that was a terrible looking place. Oh my goodness, you just can't imagine. There were ships that sunk in the harbor, and the town was all torn up, and everything was flattened out. First time we'd seen any battle damage or war damage. And our half-track quit on us part of the way, and the convoy ran off and left us outside of Le Havre. 2 Frenchmen came by, and I'd been studying my little French book they'd given us. And Arlo says, I'll find out where they went. So he hollered at these guys, says, did you see which way this convoy went? That gave we learned right there that there was a language barrier. But we did manage to catch up, and we went to a place called Chateau de Beaumoulay or something like that. Big chateau that was used for V1. Germans were using it for V1 launching there, and one bomb had hit right in the middle of that, and each side was still good, and they were being used by headquarters troops, big home there.
Okay, tell us as you go into your first battle.
We were in Luneville, France, after we had come across in a convoy from western France. We were told to get our gear on that we would use in combat. Got in our vehicles, and we slowly traveled to the east, I guess, or to the north. Not sure which. Probably to the north. After the sun had set and it was beginning to get dark, we got off and marched, got in a line and began marching, and it got dark and we could hear booming and we could see flashing on the horizon everywhere, as far as you could see. And you could hear this roar, rumble, boom, constant. Good grief, that's really something that as huge and humongous as that. We passed some troops coming out that I think we were relieving. They were sort of a ghostly bunch to me. They didn't say much. I guess they were tired. Later on I understood. As we entered the town, the edge of this town, wasn't much going on. We just, as far as being shot at or anything like that, none of that was going on. We just told this group get in this building, this group get in that building, and this, we were scattered around these houses on this edge of this town. But there's several stories involved with that particular event there. Like the tank destroyer that was knocked out across the street. And as before he was hit, the corner of the building was hit by an anti-tank shell, which Captain Helton told me later that that shell went under his bed and popped it, knocked him right out of the bed. But it didn't hurt him. The Germans finally knocked out that tank. Oh, well, tank. It was a tank destroyer is what it was. It wasn't a tank. We had one of our men was killed up there by a medic who inadvertently picked up a German rifle and shot it into the ground, or into the floor of this house, and sure enough our fellow was down in the basement, killed him. We had a barrage of German mortars firing there way early in the morning, or in the middle of the night. And we went downstairs to the basement because that was beginning to get dangerous. And there were a whole bunch of civilians down there. I'd never seen anything like that. French civilians, and they were all down there doing Hail Mary in French over and over again. They were scared to death. Mostly women and children, and maybe a few old men. We went on an attack from there after a couple of days. The thing that impressed me, one of the things that impressed me was just we hadn't gone very far, and there were two GIs lying in a hole there, dead. I never, with my uniform on, dressed like I was, with my helmet. Never saw a dead person in my life before that. I saw that fellow hit in England, but I saw him being carried off, but there he was, right as we walked right on by him. That was a very impressive thing. The reality of it was on you at that time.
Okay, so you went, y'all experienced that. When was the first, would you consider the first full-scale meeting the enemy and going into?
You mean like an attack on the Germans?
Attack, yeah.
That was it. That was it right there. We just held the edge of this town for 2 nights. The night we arrived, which by the way happened to be December the 7th, 1943, 1 year after I was, can I believe that? 1944, that's what it was, 1944. 2 years after I was sworn in. Yeah. I lost my train of thought. Where was I?
You said you had held that town for
Oh,
two days.
yeah.
2 nights.
Okay. We held it for a couple of days. Being in the position that I was in as a soldier, a simple soldier, I didn't know exactly what we were doing, except we were going to go down, and there was some kind of a barracks or something we were going to have an attack on. Went down in the town in the valley, and turned, and we were in this town, and we were beginning to come out of it, and we turned and started up, and here were some of those 23rd Tank Battalion tanks there too. And we started up this hill, and there was a lot of banging. I don't remember our receiving fire, but the Germans were up there. I'm sure they were shooting back, and some of the Germans were killed. Don't know if any of our fellows were hit. I don't remember any of our fellows getting hit. A bunch of Germans surrendered, and there was a barracks up there that had been a part of the Maginot Line of the French, and then the Germans were using it. And using it as, we learned later, as an officer candidate school. They were training those Alsatians to be officers, or training them in Alsace, anyway, Germans to be officers in the German army. But we were very careful about going up. We took control of that barracks. And then the weather was beginning to get nasty and cold. We were standing guard that night. It was very cold. Our clothes were not the best in the world for cold weather. Especially if you're a cold-natured guy like I am. And boy, you'd go stand for an hour out in the cold, and you were shaking. But we'd do that and stand in guard, watching out to make sure that the Germans weren't coming back in with a patrol or something. But we spent that night in that place. The fellows were staying in the basement because the barracks had been pretty badly punctured by gunfire and shells and things. We moved forward the next day and went to a town called Rohrbach, which is a little bit bigger town than the first one, which is the name of it is Benning. Benning is the first one, where the barracks was. We went right through the middle of Rohrbach, and that didn't seem to be too bad until we got on the other side and started up the hill. And then the Germans were up there, and they were shooting machine guns. And you lie there, and where my platoon was at that time, the bullets were hitting the ground somewhere up there, and they were going over. Sounded like they were up kind of high, just flying over. So they weren't shooting right into where we were. We made a pretty good attack up that hill because Captain Helton had, we were told, the word came from Captain Helton, that there would be some mortar fire at the top of this hill, edge of this hill, coming after we were coming out of town. And as soon as that fire was completed, we were to get up and move forward. And we did that. We got up and moved forward and went up there, firing as we went. And we got to the top of the hill, and the only Germans I saw up there was one that was badly wounded. He was lying up there. But that was the beginning of the worst time of my life, because it was so cold. It started raining, and it would snow at night, it would rain in the daytime, and we were out in that place without very good clothes. Oh, it was bad, very bad.
As y'all were starting, you've had 2 battles. What is the feeling of your companies, you men as a group and as individuals? How did y'all see each other? What was that like?
Well, I can't speak for other people very well. We were, I guess we felt that we depended on each other to a certain extent. What happened to me was pretty soon I got to the point of judgment and evaluation of people. Some people were more dependable than others. Some were willing to do the job that they were told to do, and others were reluctant to do it. And that's the kind of way I looked at other people, from the standpoint of doing the job in the face of fire. But we were just great friends, huh? We'd have a good time together when things were quiet and we were back somewhere, and we'd joke around a lot and have criticisms of each other just in a friendly sort of way. We try to figure out ways to improve the food condition, like finding garlic and cutting it up in our meat and beans and sea rations. That helped your own feeling about your food, but it didn't help those around you.
Tell me, is there any remembrances that you had of a really funny experience with your buddies? Or
That's a good question. That's one that I know that there were some really funny things that happened. Like I heard a lot more than I saw. Like one fellow who was in this house and by a window, and a shell hit somewhere, and then a whole bunch started coming. He jumped out the window and ended up right in the manure pile. That's pretty bad. That was pretty bad. That kind of stuff.
I heard a story about some wine that got passed amongst 17th.
Well, that's a Ray Collier story, and it's true. We were in a town called Schweighausen, and this was in the early part of January, middle of January. I don't know, the early part of January. And boy, it was cold outside. Snow was on the ground, and it was frozen hard, and it was really cold. One day, I went over to see where Ray was. This was in quiet. We weren't on the front, okay? We were back. And in fact, we were on outpost because the bulge was going on. And I went over to his place and I said, "What are you guys doing?" "Oh man, come on in, come on in. I want you to try something." So he took he said, "Give me a canteen cup." He took my canteen cup and he gave it to one of the fellows, and he went down in the basement. Somebody came back. And I said, "Is that for me?" He said, "Yeah." But wait a minute. He put it on the stove and heated it up. He said, "Now drink this. This will warm you up." It was red wine. That was bad. I kind of lost control of things with that. Because it really began to show, because and that was kind of funny. My squad leader Charlie Rooma had been wounded back in Benning. And so our replacement squad leader, he saw when I went back to where our squad was, he saw what was happening, and he says, "Okay, we're going to have mortar practice. Hatt, you're going to practice like you're the gunner's assistant. I want you to you're going to have to get out and set the mortar up." And I couldn't set that mortar up because the ground was slick with hard ice, and I'd try to bang this thing into it. Finally, I looked up at him. He was just laughing his head off. I kind of lost control of myself there. That tells you one thing. You don't want to be intoxicated and go into combat. I never was. Never did that. Never did that. Ray Collier got me into that one. And he gets the credit for that. Bill Little probably had something to do with it, too.
Tell me about the outpost. You said the bulge was going and y'all were put on outpost. Explain that situation to me.
We were not on the front at that time, but where we were located on highways, and apparently at a place, for example, where we were, we had one of those big tanks with us. So there was our squad and a big tank, and the tank was in a building on the side of the road. It was like a garage building, tall. And he came up there and punched a hole in it with his gun, so he gave his gun aimed down. And then our job was to stand at the side of the road and stop every vehicle and ask for identification. And the word was that the Germans had parachuted their troopers, into our side of the lines and had them in American uniforms. And we needed to find those fellows or stop them because they were back there to cause bad problems. So I call that's what I call an outpost. Also, we replaced, one time, it looked like the Germans were getting ready to move through there. And they took and set us out on an outpost on the side of a road, just our squad, with our half-track out in the field. And we had a hole there. It was already dug. I don't know why, but it was. And our job was to stay there, and they said, now, we think the Germans are going to come through there with tanks, okay, on this road. Says, you stay down, and when they come in, and the first tank goes by and the second one comes up there, you take that bazooka up there and you shoot that tank. That was an outpost. And we were by ourselves out there. It wasn't like a whole company of men or a battalion or something like that. Just, we were on the side of the road. But they didn't come through. Boy, were we thankful of that. They didn't show up.
Okay, tell me, let's get on past Rohrbach.
On past Rohrbach. Mm-hmm. Well, I was past Rohrbach with that story, but the significant thing that happened after the event I just told you about, being put on outpost, and that was when we were staying in Schweighausen, and we were told to load up, and Capretta, our squad sergeant at that time, fill-in, he was a corporal, he came back and he said, okay, we've got a map here, and the Rhine River's back here, and we're going to go, and here's a little town here, and here's where we are, and we're going to go down there, and we're going to make an attack toward this town, and we're going to take it. And there are 800 troops back there, if I remember that right, something German troops, but we're all going to go down there, and we're going to be able to handle this job. We loaded up into the half-tracks, I don't know, late in the evening, maybe before midnight, and traveled. Put, real slow for a long way, and the fields were just white with snow, and it was cold. We got to a little town. Everybody off. Everybody got out. Get your equipment. Move forward to the front of the convoy. It was like walking on ice. It was so slippery. And we gathered and started marching, and this is where we head toward the place that we refer to as Hurlesheim. It was, we were pretty quiet. We knew we were getting into something, but we felt like it maybe wasn't so bad because there were only 800 German troops up there, and there were a lot more of us than there were of them. We marched until daylight, and we were in a town called Waresheim. As we were exiting Waresheim, it was beginning to get daylight. We got outside of Waresheim, and you could hear some of the stuff up and down the front when you were in that position, gun shooting and all that. but not really close. I said, okay, fellas, get off the side of the road and dig in. Boy, you talk about digging in. How'd you like to take one of those entrenching tools and dig through the concrete floor here? You know, that ice was really hard. But we managed, my buddy and I managed to dig through the ice, and we got the hole dug, and they said, okay, back on the road. Here we're going to move it out. So,
What was your buddy's name?
I'm gonna
Okay.
that name thing is really getting me.
Okay, that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, we had, as we were marching down this road, we began to hear machine guns firing up ahead. I don't know, it sounded like it's maybe a mile away or something. And pretty soon there was some boom, boom, boom. Uh-oh, that doesn't sound so good. You hear a burp gun. You know what a burp gun is? A gun that shoots like, sounds like you're tearing paper. Burp. And then come back with a ratty-tat-tat, which sounds more like an American. I thought, well, Americans and Germans are shooting at each other up there. I don't know who they are. But we crossed a little canal, which later turned out to be the Zorn River. And then we crossed it again on an engineer's bridge. And all that shooting seemed to stop by the time we'd gotten down that far. But that's where we started our attack across there toward a town called Ophendorf. And there was a Steinwald Woods off to the side. You want more of that? When we arrived at the engineer's bridge, which was just two things that just big enough, wide enough for tracks, tank tracks to go across, or a truck. Notice that the engineers had guys up on the edge with their rifles and all that. Uh-oh, we're getting into something now. And as we came up out of this river thing, that was kind of a depression there, shortly we noticed that there were some fellows coming out with their hands up, Germans, coming out of, there were a few bushes scattered, you know, around, but basically it was an open area. And the Germans were hiding in those bushes. And apparently they had radios or something. As we moved forward, the woods on the side were a little scary because we didn't know what was in there. We were led to understand, our leaders were, that it was to be cleared out by another unit. And I remember running up along a canal there, down kind of low, and getting really close to those things. And before that, one of our fellows was hit in the hand by something, a shot or something hit him, spun him around, threw him nose around. Then there was some shells fell over to our left. Some tanks were coming up in there. The Germans were shooting out of the woods toward the tanks. I could see that fire flash. Boom, it hit our tanks. Pretty soon I saw a little light tank carrying a guy out on the back, and all bloody looking, over about 100 yards away. That was Ray Collier. We went so far and we stopped. Our tanks took a beating. They couldn't keep going with us. And we were told to dig in. Well, there we got out that thing and began to hack at the ice again. And we managed to dig a hole. I looked around, some of the guys, they hit it a few times, they gave up. I thought, well, I'm not going to give up. So we dug a hole and we got down inside that thing. That thing was about that deep. And then here came what I'd say were probably 88 artillery type 88 shell, bang, and you could hear the shrapnel. They go boom, and you hear, and hit the mud or the ice. And boom, boom. Those pieces of shrapnel were flying around. Boy, it sure is nice to be down in this hole. I wonder what our other guys are doing. I know that at least one guy got hit up there because I helped carry him out. But we were safe down there where we were. We felt glad that we had a hole to climb in. But then the Air Force was called in, Air Corps, and some P-47s came over and began to drop bombs. They dropped several bombs on the woods. And I've been back in the woods and found some of those bomb craters. They're still there. Then we were told we were going to retreat, move back toward that river. And one of the fellows hollered at me, hey, can you help us? Says, so-and-so here has been hit and he can't walk. And you're pretty strong, you're a big guy. How about helping us? I said, okay, if you'll carry my bazooka and if you'll get all my stuff. And we took a rifle, and this fellow sat on a rifle, and we carried that guy out of there on a rifle. You never heard such expressions of appreciation in your life. He was glad to be carried out of there. And we were the last ones to move back because we weren't moving too fast. We'd have to stop and rest every once in a while. And the Germans were shooting these aerial explosion things, but they were way up high, and they weren't a problem. That evening we were told to dig in again. I was tired of digging. I didn't dig anymore. I quit digging by that time. It was dark. But you'd be surprised how much you can see when there's snow on the ground at night. Then I heard the story came over to me from one of the guys while we were sitting out there on that ice. And I said, Ray Collier was hit today. Did you know that? No, I didn't know that. And I heard a gun go off down the way, and so some of the medics were running, and so later on, what happened? I said, well, one of the guys shot himself in the foot. I guess he'd had all he wanted of that stuff. We laid out there on that ice, and, you know, we get when you had something that stayed awake, you'd lie down and you kind of get together, so you kind of keep from getting so cold. And you'd wake up, and when I couldn't sleep, I'd get up and walk around and talk to some of the guys. Next morning, before daybreak, the sergeants were all called back, came back and said, okay, we're going to pull back and go along the river here, and we're going to take this town down here. It's over to the side. Instead of the one we were heading for originally, we're going to go take this one over here. So we're in our usual lined out fashion, moving along. It's funny, you know, I don't remember any shooting, but I know there was some, because I know some of the guys that got hit that have told me about it later. But we marched along the Zorn River, and then we turned and we crossed some tanks. The tanks were going, and it was in the dark, and the tanks were separated. The tank would go by and they'd say, okay, run across, you know, between the tanks. It's kind of scary. If you slipped down, you were in trouble. You really were. We moved across abreast of the town, and then turned to our left flank and headed toward the town. And we captured a whole bunch of German troops that were there. with their guns facing the other way because they thought the Americans were coming from the other direction. You know, that was just that was the beginning of the really bad part. All day long, it was bad in there. Germans attacking and finally ending up capturing a whole bunch of our guys, including Captain Hilton and our battalion commander and Lieutenant Drum. And I got out. I got out. I was one of the few that got out.
How many of you got out of all your group, out of your
I think there were
units?
fewer than 40 out of the 200 and some odd were left.
Can you talk about that feeling? Describe
That feeling?
the feeling of that day.
I felt like we were doing the job we were supposed to do. When we saw enemy, we'd shoot, and we were afraid all the time, being as careful as we could not to be exposing ourselves unless we just had to. Bad feeling. There was bad feeling. Food wasn't very good. We had some K-rations stuck in jackets. But I did find some of the nicest canned plums down in the basement of one of those Alsatian houses. And I said, boy, that looks good. And I just helped myself to that. Boy, I'll tell you, I was bad. I was sick. Clear down to Colmar after that. That was a mistake, eating those things.
When you were looking over the day and you had lots of friends that were killed, lots of friends that were captured,
Mm-hmm.
was there just how did you feel personally about, I was lucky to get through? Or
Yes.
That
Yes, that's exactly right. I was lucky to get through that. I was lucky. You do the best you can to protect yourself, and then sometimes you see people who you would see people who were not careful, and they would expose themselves, or they wouldn't dig their foxhole or something, huh? And who are they to blame? Themselves. But a lot of it happened to guys that were doing everything they could, and they would get hit. The feeling I had was certainly one of nervousness and fright, about what was going on, and seeing the German tanks and all that stuff. And Sergeant George Drost and I that evening, as we were pulling back and got separated from the rest of our platoon, we ran into a whole bunch of German soldiers. And thank God George Cox's tank was there. It had been knocked out, and we hid behind that thing. That saved our lives. But after we went through there, and we threw hand grenades at them, and they threw them at us, and we emptied our rifles on them, and we ran on down the street, and they shot machine guns. Bullets were flying by us on each side like this. How did they miss us? How did they do that? And we finally got into it. I began to laugh. I said, God, George. Now that was a feeling. You know what a feeling of euphoria is? Have you ever had a feeling of euphoria? You know what I mean? I had it. Now there was an honest to goodness, really strong emotional feeling that I had. I just laughed. He said, what the hell are you laughing about? I said, hey, George, only you and I could have gotten away with that. But there was one place where I had a really strong emotional feeling right there.
we are about run out of tape, so we're going to stop here.
3 more minutes.
3 more minutes? Oh, okay.
You might just sort of give us a recap of what falls through Comar and all that.
Okay. My stories do tend to get long, but in detail. But we went down to Colmar, That was so different because we were able to really be successful down there. We lost some people, but we certainly were beating the Germans very badly. We pulled back from there and went into a kind of a rest area, then to a place called the Baby Factory, and we were in a defensive position there. We had some very successful events happen at that place. We were pulled back to Zimming Barracks, and at Zimming Barracks we spent a few days. We had ordered to paint out the 12th Armored Division on all of our equipment, and we were sent up to the 3rd Army. We started at Trier and headed east into Germany. First time we'd been in Germany. And boy, it was something to see how German equipment had been broken through by the infantry divisions that had gone through there, and they sent us right down the middle. We moved very fast. We never stopped. We never stopped to rest. There wasn't any shooting to speak of. Germans were surrendering in droves. Sometimes the German people would be out waving flags for us to come through, then we ended up at the Rhine River. Then we turned south to close off the Germans, and what happened there, we did that, but we lost a lot of people. We crossed the Rhine River, and our next really bad place was at the Tauber River, and the Germans had decided they were going to, apparently, I've learned in the recent years, they were going to use that as the next line of defense. And we lost a lot of guys down at the Tauber River. But we managed to break through that after about a day or so. And then it was a matter of just, it seemed like we were going around in circles and from town to town and picking up German soldiers and fighting in some places and not in others. And then we headed south toward the Danube River. We were moving pretty fast, and we'd have some casualties every now and then, but it wasn't anything like we'd had previously. But we did fight right up to the Alps mountains. And the last day we were in combat, we were running into German soldiers up there, SS, could see them up in the mountains, and they were shooting artillery back at us, or mortars or something, and killed a young major right outside of a building where my squad was. We'd run to take cover inside the building, and that guy didn't do it. And when we came back out, he was dead. And that happened on the last day of the war. When it was over with, and by that time it was the 5th of May. Now there's an emotional feeling. You're through. You don't have to worry about setting out outposts. You know, you're not going to get shot at anymore. You hope, you feel like that's going to be, and it was. That's the way it was. We did some work going around from village to village, taking up arms that the German soldiers or the German government had left with people to fight against the Americans when they came through. They didn't do that. They just turned this stuff over to us, and they knew the war was over. We guarded the 7th Army ration dump, which is where all the PX rations were, and all the candy was there. My squad was in there. You know, you can turn into a criminal when you have that kind of a job. They carry a whole box full of Baby Ruths out. So we had all the candy we could eat. But that's kind of the way it went. And they began to break the outfit up, sending the fellows with high points home, and the younger ones like myself still didn't have enough points. They separated us and preparing to send us back to the U.S. to be ready to go to the Pacific. Well, we certainly did not want to do that, but it looked like there wasn't anything we could do about that. But that was the end of it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I
Tammy?
appreciate it.